Between all of the upsets that we saw, and the race for the major getting really tight for every region, there are a lot of interesting storylines that we have to cover here. And since I'm trying to make these recaps shorter, we don't have much time to do it. So, let's get into it. While there was a lot of chaos later in the tournament, the first round started off pretty calm. There were a bunch of comfortable victories, with the only series going into 5 games being Space Station over NRG. And according to the seeding, there were 2 upsets, but neither one of them were that big, if they can be considered an upset at all. The first one was Version 1 beating Shopify Rebellion in a 3-0 sweep. And while Rebellion was the higher seeded team, and Version 1 just came off of a really disappointing debut in the Spring Open, a team with Beast Mode and Daniel beating Shopify Rebellion really shouldn't be seen as too much of a surprise. And the other upset according to the seeding was Furia beating Dignitas. But since Furia got a sweep over Dignitas the last time they played in the Spring Open, them also getting the win here in this tournament also isn't too much of a surprise. But after a pretty normal first round, everything got flipped on its head in the second round. The top 4 teams in the region and the top 4 seeds in the tournament were Complexity, FaZe Clan, Gen G, and G2. And in the second round, all 4 of those teams lost. Complexity lost to Version 1 after V1's offense absolutely popped off in this series, which is a good sign for them because in the last event, their offense struggled. Then G2 lost to Optic after G2 went up 2 games to 1 in the series, then Optic shut out G2 in Game 4 and Game 5 to steal the victory. FaZe Clan took their loss to Furia, where just like G2, they went up in the series 2 games to 1, but instead of getting shut out in Game 4 and Game 5, the last 2 games were pretty high scoring affairs, with Furia taking both of them. And finally, Space Station beat Gen G with some really impressive defense, because Space Station managed to win the series in 4 games, despite never scoring more than 2 goals in a single game themselves. So shutting down an offense as good as Gen G's to the point where you only need 2 goals to win the game is a very impressive feat. And now this result, all 4 of the top 4 seeds were in the lower bracket, making this probably the hardest lower bracket that we've ever seen in a regional. But now moving into that lower bracket, we had a mixture of easy victories and tough battles. NRG got a 3-0 sweep over Heybro, and Dignitas got a pretty hard-fought 3-1 victory over 0-1. But the other 2 matches were really intense. Koi knocked out M80 in 5 games, after M80 almost put off the reverse sweep by winning games 3 and 4. But Koi got game 5 to move on to the next round. And in the final game of this round, after Team Axel won game 1 and 2 in overtime, Shopify did pull off the reverse sweep to move on to the next round and avoid what would have been a really disappointing result for this team. But now the second round in the lower bracket is where we would see all the chaos come to a head, because this is where all of the top 4 seeds had to fight for their life. FaZe Clan didn't have too hard of a time because they beat Koi in a 3-0 sweep after scoring 16 goals in the 3 games combined. But the rest of the higher seeded teams would have a much tougher time. G2 and Dignitas traded wins in their series, going all the way to game 5. But G2 got the win by a score of 2-1 in that final game to save their tournament and give their major chances a bit more hope. Complexity vs NRG gave us another tight series that went all the way to 5 games, but unlike G2, Complexity couldn't finish the job, because in that final game, we see NRG get the win by a score of 2-1, off of the back of 2 solo plays from Squishy. And these 2 goals had to feel really good for him, especially after he's been the target of a lot of people's criticism during NRG's struggles. And this result also meant that the winner of the last regional wouldn't even make it to the top 8 in this regional. And the other grand finalist last time around was Gen G, and they were having just as hard of a time in this round as Complexity. They lost the first 2 games in their series against Rebellion, and they found themselves in the position where they had to get a reverse sweep to win. And it looked like they were on their way to doing that after they won Game 3 and Game 4. But in the final game of the series, Shopify turned it on offense by having their highest scoring game of the entire series and taking this last game by a score of 4-3, eliminating Gen G on the first day. And with the results in this round, the top 2 teams in the last regional were both officially out before the top 8 in this regional. So upsets were for sure the story of the day here. But after day 1 gave us a bunch of chaos, day 2 started off pretty normally, because FaZe Clan got a sweep over Shopify Rebellion to go into the top 6. And their really strong run through the lower bracket continued, because to this point, they had played 6 games in the lower bracket, and they had 6 wins too. And the other match in this round saw an old school rivalry get renewed, with G2 going up against NRG. These teams had only played 2 times so far this season, and G2 won both of them comfortably. So between those results and the team's overall form coming into this matchup, G2 was a heavy favorite. But this was the series that showed NRG wasn't going to be as easy to knock out as they were earlier in the season, because this series went all the way to Game 5, and then NRG won that Game 5 by a score of 2-0 to go into the top 6 and knock G2 out of the tournament, putting their chance at the Spring Major in some serious doubt. And this is a huge deal for them, because since the start of the 21-22 season, G2 has never missed a major, so missing out for the first time here would have to hurt. But now going into the upper bracket, we had Version 1 going up against Optic. And between Optic's really good form recently and Version 1 having their high ceiling with Daniel, this was expected to be a close matchup. But Version 1 got a dominant 4-0 sweep over Optic, where the Green Wall only managed to score 3 goals combined in the 4 games. And in the next series, Space Station went up against Furia to see who would get the chance to face off against Version 1 in the upper bracket final. But just like they did against Gen G, Space Station stepped up their defense to another level, because after Furia scored 4 goals in Game 1, Space Station only allowed them to score 4 goals over the last 5 games of the series. And because of that strong defense, Space Station won this series in 6 games and knocked Furia to the lower bracket. Then for the next match, we had a showdown between 2 of the most famous orgs in all of esports, with FaZe Clan going up against Optic Gaming to see who would be in the top 4 and who would be eliminated. But this match wasn't nearly as exciting as a lot of people probably expected, because FaZe Clan got this series win in a 4-0 sweep that seemed way easier than it should have been. Optic, and especially AJ, have been in really good form recently, but on this day, they had one series against Version 1 and another series against FaZe, and in those series they played 8 games and got 0 wins. And their high-powered offense was nowhere to be found, because in those 8 games they only scored a total of 6 goals. It should be said that Version 1 and FaZe Clan were both in really good form, so these matches were going to be hard no matter what, but I'm sure that Optic would have liked to make these series more competitive. But while Optic finished off a really tough day, FaZe was continuing a really strong run through the lower bracket, because now they had played 10 games in their lower bracket run and they won all 10. And the last match of this day was Furia against NRG. These 2 teams had historically had really high expectations from the community, but only one of them would get the chance to realize that here by making it into the top 4. And from the start of the series, NRG set the tone with their defense, because they only allowed Furia to score 1 goal in the first 3 games, and they jumped out to a 3-0 series lead. Furia got 2 wins after they called a timeout following Game 3, but then NRG called their own timeout following Game 5, and they finished off the series in 6 games. And now, NRG would be playing in Championship Sunday for the first time since the Fall Cup. So while I won't go as far to say that NRG is back, this is without a doubt a really good performance that their fans have been waiting to see for a long time now. Now going into Championship Sunday, we started off with a bit of a grudge match, because we had Daniel and his new team Version 1 going up against his old team Space Station. So while both of these teams were without a doubt very motivated already, you have to imagine that there is just a little bit of extra fire underneath them to try to get the win in this matchup. But if there was, Version 1's fire burned a lot brighter. After Space Station took Game 1, V1 took the next 4 games to win this series in 5 and go on to the Grand Finals. And I had already mentioned FaZe Clan's strong run through the lower bracket, but Version 1 was starting to have a very similar run in the upper bracket. So far in this tournament, they had played 15 games, and they only lost 2, one of them being the Space Station here, and the other loss being to the Spring Open champions Complexity. So Version 1 was looking really good. But down in the lower bracket, FaZe Clan wasn't going to be outdone, because after NRG took Game 1 off of FaZe to give them their first loss in the lower bracket this tournament, FaZe Clan also took the next 4 games in the series to win this series in 5 games in the exact same fashion as V1 did over SSG. And this really strong run continued in the lower bracket final, because FaZe Clan got a dominant victory over Space Station in 5 games after they took the first 3 games of the series, then dropped Game 4 to turn this into a gentleman's sweep. So now on their lower bracket run, FaZe Clan had played 20 games and they only dropped 2. After this team lost to Furia, nobody was even close to matching them on the field. But that would change heading into the Grand Finals, because FaZe Clan's really strong lower bracket run would go up against V1's really strong upper bracket run. So a lot of people would have to figure that this match would be extremely tight all the way through. And for the first 2 games, that's exactly what we saw. Version 1 won the first game after over 4.5 minutes of overtime, then FaZe won the second game after over 2 minutes of overtime. So this series started off really tight. And while the rest of the games in the series would also be really close, only one team would get the victories, because Version 1 took close wins in Game 3, 4, and 5 to shut down FaZe Clan's attempt at a bracket reset and get the regional victory, giving Daniel his first ever regional win since he came into the RLCS at the start of last season's winter split. And this completes a huge turnaround for Version 1, because they won this event after not making it to the top 8 in the last one. And there are a few different things that we could look at if we wanted to break down why they did so much better here. We could talk about their really strong defense and how they led the event in goals allowed per game. Or we could talk about Daniel's absurd assist stat, because he led all players in this event in assists per game, and he really showed off a level of passing and playmaking that we probably haven't seen for his entire career. But in the short amount of time that I have here, there's only one thing that I want to look at, and that's demos. I'm sure a lot of you know by now that Common's one of the most demo heavy players in the entire world. But in this event, he went absolutely crazy, even compared to his really high standard. In the Spring Cup, he had 3.86 demos per game. And to illustrate just how many that is, that's the most that he's ever had in a single event per game, with his previous record being 2.77 in this season's Fall Invitational. So Calm beat his own career high in demos per game by over 1 full demolition per game. So if we thought he was going demo crazy before, it seems like that was only the start of it. And even when he wasn't getting demos, he would still be bumping somebody off of the play or just threatening a bump to throw the defense into chaos and make scoring easier for his teammates. And that's good because he was hardly involved in the scoring himself. In just the first game of the Grand Finals, he had 7 demos, and 2 of the goals that he helped create didn't even have one. Because for the first goal of that game, the second Daniel goes up in the air with the ball, Calm turns off ball cam and goes on the hunt. First Killer turns around to challenge, but when he sees Calm, he knows he can't do that and turns around again to try to avoid him. He does eventually jump to avoid the demo, but by this point the damage is already done, because now Daniel has a bunch of space on the ball and he can take all the time he wants with it. So he stays patient and keeps the ball close to him while he's out of boost, getting a 50 with Sypical on the goal line and winning it, forcing the ball into the goal, giving V1 the early lead. Then in overtime of that same game, Calm takes the ball away from Sypical, then immediately drives upfield. So when the ball comes over to Daniel again, Calm is already tracking down First Killer. And when Daniel takes a shot, Calm only gets a slight bump on First Killer, but that's all he needs to throw him off and essentially take him out of the play. And this bump, combined with Daniel bumping off Sypical while he's in the air, means that Mist is the defender with the best chance of making the save, but he can't get there in time and Version 1 gets the win. But while this tournament was hype enough on its own, the stakes get even higher when you think about the implications for the Spring Major, because now all of the teams in the top 6 are only separated by 4 points, and the next 4 teams beneath them aren't too far away. And shout out to the statistics goat Direct for already putting together this list showing what teams need to do to clinch their spot in the major or to avoid elimination. So no matter how it shakes out, and no matter who you're cheering for, the North American Spring Invitational is going to be a very wild ride. Now let's get into the best of the rest, because we have a lot of interesting stuff to talk about. Starting off in the Middle East, after Rule 1 got the regional championship in the first event and Team Falcons only finished in 4th place, it seemed like the major picture for the region might have already been decided, but it turned out that wouldn't be the case at all. Just like everybody expected, Team Falcons and Rule 1 easily made their way through the tournament and met up in the upper bracket final. And this series went back and forth, with Rule 1 winning the first 2 games, then Team Falcons winning the next 3, before it ultimately went to Game 7, where Team Falcons got that last victory to go to the grand final. Also, it's important to say that Mauston for Rule 1 didn't score a single goal the entire series. Mauston was brought in before the winter split to help Rule 1 get the edge over Falcons, but nearly every time these teams meet up in the RLCS, Mauston really struggles to make an impact, and because of that, Falcons still have the edge in the matchup. Now even with this loss, most people expected Rule 1 to win their series in the lower bracket to make their way to the grand finals for a rematch against Team Falcons, but that didn't end up happening, because in that lower bracket final, where they went up against Twisted Minds, a team that features Venom, Samway, and former Falcons player Senzo, Twisted Minds got the 4-0 sweep over Rule 1, and they locked in their own place in the grand final while knocking Rule 1 out of the tournament. And this is their second event in a row with a huge upset, because in the last regional, they beat Team Falcons in the top 4 to knock them out too. So Twisted Minds have been pulling off some really impressive wins recently, including their huge upset here. But unfortunately for them, they couldn't pull it off in the grand finals. After they won the first game in the series, Team Falcons took the next 4 and won the series in 5 games, meaning that heading into the last regional, Rule 1 and Team Falcons are separated by only 3 points. And with the lead that they have over the rest of the region, this means that if either Rule 1 or Team Falcons wins the Middle Eastern Spring Invitational, they'll represent their region at the Spring Major. But Twisted Minds is also in the picture too, because they're only 1 point behind Falcons. And if they somehow manage to win the regional, then they at least guarantee a tiebreaker for a chance to make it to the major. And if they win while Rule 1 doesn't finish second, then they'll make the major with no tiebreaker being needed. And while no Middle Eastern team besides Rule 1 or Team Falcons have won a regional so far this season, I don't think you can totally count out Twisted Minds, because they gotta win over Falcons and over Rule 1 in separate events. So if they can now combine those and get those wins in the same event, then it's all theirs. So the last regional of the season for the Middle East could very well also be the best. And if you thought the scenario in the Middle East was exciting, wait until you hear about OCE. So the only 3 teams we need to worry about in this region are still Ground Zero, Pioneers, and Power. And since Ground Zero was the 1 seed, they got all the way to the upper bracket finals without needing to worry about the other 2 teams. but Pioneers and Power had to face each other before they got there. Last time around in the Spring Open, Power won this matchup against Pioneers in 5 games on their way to winning the entire regional. But this time Pioneers got the win in 5 games to go on to the upper bracket finals to face off against Ground Zero. But this is where things really get fun, because on Championship Sunday, when Ground Zero and Pioneers went up against each other, Pioneers came into this series with a sub, because Tango filled in for Hunter. Pioneers had already been struggling against Ground Zero, even when they were playing with their full roster, so you had to think that bringing in a sub would make things worse. But instead of making things worse, Pioneers actually went on to win this series in 7 games with Tango, giving them just their second win over Ground Zero in their last 7 matchups with them. And Pioneers won the series after coming back from 3-1 down without Tango scoring a single goal. Although he did have 5 assists and he led the team in saves, so he was still doing a lot to help out. Then Ground Zero got a dominant series win over Power by beating them in 5 games and only letting them score twice in the entire series. And this set up a rematch against Pioneers in the grand final. And while the first series was close and went all the way to 7 games, this series wasn't close at all, because Pioneers got the 4-0 sweep over Ground Zero, and they locked in their regional title while playing with the sub. Now, it's not like Tango is just some random player that they picked up, because he was actually playing for an RLCS team last season too. And with his performance helping Pioneers get the regional championship, he showed that he still has a lot of skills left over. In looking at the major implications for this region, with these results, Pioneers, Ground Zero, and Power are all tied at 40 points heading into the last regional. And with OCE having 2 major spots up for grabs, whoever gets eliminated first out of these 3 teams will be knocked out of the major, and the other 2 will go on to Boston. And this even has huge implications for Worlds too, because while Pioneers are almost completely locked in, Power and Ground Zero are only 4 points away from each other. So one of them making it to the major and the other one staying home will lock in that team spot at Worlds too. So make sure you keep your eyes on this region, because it's going to be a very fun end to the season. Before we go, one more quick piece of news. This past weekend, both FaZe Clan and Team Falcons locked in their place to the World Championship. And while it was basically already guaranteed that they're going to qualify at some point, they still deserve a lot of credit for doing it so early. Because FaZe is the second North American team to qualify after Gen G, and Team Falcons is the first team out of the Middle East. So now for them, it's just a race to get a higher seed. But alright, I'll see you all next week. And of course, thanks for watching.